Well, looks like maybe JLC is gonna have me eating my words this week. Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso, and yes, today we're talking about a new model from JLC. Now before I get into this new model, I want to give a little bit of context to this video in relation to my last video, which was featuring the JLC Master Compressor. If you want to skip this whole context part and jump right into my summary of the new watch, you can find the timestamps in the description below so you can jump ahead. So last week I released a video talking about the JLC Master Compressor, which in my view was their last original design collection. And I talked about how JLC serves as a great example of this growing trend in the industry of where companies are just doing vintage reissues or heavily vintage inspired design and not really pushing the new designs as much. Now I didn't do that just to pick on JLC. It just so happens that if you look at their current collection, it's the Reverso, which is from the 1930s. It's the Master Collection, which was just released, which was directly inspired from the 1950s. And the Polaris Collection, which was inspired from the 1960s. The Duomet is the only one that has any sort of modern design element to it. So it served as a very good way to illustrate the point. But in no means was my intention necessarily to single out JLC. They just served as a very good example of it. You know, Omega does it. If you look at the Seamaster Collection as a whole, including the Planet Ocean, for example, it's pretty much a greatest hits of their attempts to make a Submariner rival. Or Breitling recently has been doing lots of vintage reissues. Both of Blancpain's divers are vintage inspired or vintage reissued. And of course there were a lot of people saying it sounded like I was giving Rolex a pass on this. When it comes to Rolex, I feel that they still lack a lot of creativity. I mean, their last properly new design was the Yachtmaster 2, which better not talk about how that looks, and the Sky Dweller, which is essentially a bigger date just with a subdial in the center of it. But their problem, in my view, isn't one of vintage reissues or being stuck in the past. I think they're perpetually stuck in the present, never looking at the past because they don't really do vintage reissues, and they're never really looking at the future either because they barely ever make new forward-thinking designs. They're perpetually trying to just stay in the present and evolve at Porsche 911 pace. So I wanted to clear that up, but also it's really good timing having this new release because it shows the other side of the coin. At the very end of my video, I talked about how I'm still actually torn between whether I'm in favor of all of this vintage inspired stuff or whether I'm really against it. Because on the one hand, I do wish there was more forward-looking design. It's what keeps things interesting and different. But on the other hand, of course, you know, vintage design, vintage reissues means you can have all of the advantages of how good watches have looked in the past, both modern sizing, modern mechanics, modern reliability. And so that brings us to the new JLC Polaris Mariner Date and Mariner Memovox, two additions to the Polaris line, which is clearly inspired from the 1968 Polaris. And both of these, I think, push the collection in new directions that it wasn't previously. And the reason I say I should eat my words is because these are two very good looking watches. There's no denying it. So let's look at the Memovox first. So with the exception of Vulcain, JLC is probably the most renowned maker of alarm watches. They've been making them for decades. They've put the Memovox name across tons of their collections over the past few years. And an alarm is a great sort of halfway house in terms of reaching towards things like minute repeaters and chiming watches as well, because it has that same sort of sonic experience. However, it is less complicated to make comparatively, and that's why it's more accessible. But also it's a lot more useful in many cases, and that's epitomized with the new Polaris Mariner Memovox. Because both of these new Polaris Mariners are full-on, fully-fledged dive watches. ISO certified, 300-meter water resistance, unidirectional ratcheting bezels, the works. These are proper dive watches. And they even feature little micro extensions in the clasp. So maybe not a full-on glide lock, but it's essentially two easy links. So they're bringing their A game in terms of the dive watch credentials, and putting an alarm in a dive watch makes perfect sense. A mechanical alarm actually creates vibrations so you can feel it on your wrist. It's not just a case of hearing it like you might with a phone alarm, for example. And that's something that I think is very useful in the tool sense. If someone is actually using their watch as a dive watch, being able to have a tactile sensation of when you need to go up, an actual physical reminder, I think in the context of if you are using a watch as a diving instrument, I think it's an extremely useful tool. And again, it's true to JLC's heritage and history. This is a historic complication for them. It's one that they've used for such a long time. It's a great way for them to honor the Polaris design, make it a dive watch, and include one of their signature complications. So in that sense, I think it's a great addition. Next, we have the Polaris Mariner Date, which, if I'm being honest, is more where my interest lies because it is something that I think is a lot easier to quantify in comparison to other watches. Whereas something like the Memovox, it doesn't really have that many natural competitors. And given this time of the year, this time last month, we were talking about new Rolex models, and they also had a dive watch. But honestly, this Polaris Mariner Date is a stunner. It's got this really good looking black and then dark blue and then blue in the center gradient dial. It reminds me a lot of the gradient fade that they had on their limited edition World Timer Polaris. That style of dial is what they've applied to both the Mariner Date and the Mariner Memovox. And on top of that, on the inside of the Mariner Date, they've upgraded their caliber 899 to now have 70 hours of power reserve, in addition to going through the Master 1000 hours, and of course visible through the case back. All of this packed into a very objectively good looking watch. Regardless of what you think about its inspiration, I think this is definitely a win. And also one little change that they've done for both of these watches is that they've ratcheted the internal bezel. I've read a lot of comments in forums and groups that when you have an internal rotating bezel that isn't ratcheted, sometimes it can be a bit annoying to get it with that precision because you have to do it through a crown versus actually turning it like a normal bezel. So with this ratcheting system, it means you have that perfect precision, and also, of course, to be a dive watch, it has to be unidirectional. So they made sure of that as well. And there are also nice little touches, like for example, there's an orange indicator when you have the bezel crown unscrewed, so that you know that it's open and it might compromise the water resistance. This is very, very similar to that master compressor line, which had indicators as well. It's little details like this, ergonomic improvements, that I think JLC doesn't get anywhere near as much credit as it deserves, especially when you think that everyone is so easy to praise companies like Rolex for things like the Glide Lock, Easy Link, etc. But JLC is always doing little ergonomic improvements, things like their quick release straps and quick release buckles, things like the master compressor crowns. They're always going the extra mile on so many of their watches to make them that little bit more usable, more user friendly. Same thing on the reversal when they switched from having pusher adjusters for changing the time zones to now having a little switch that's hidden when you don't have the reversal pushed out. Again, another great innovation that just makes it easier to use and better looking as well. So now we should probably talk about price on these. Well, the Memovox is $17,000 US, and as I mentioned before, it doesn't really have that many natural competitors. But the Mariner Date, that's another story. I mentioned before, recently Rolex released their new Submariner. That one cost $9,500 US. Spec-wise, they're very similar, though the Rolex is a little bit thinner. But honestly, if I had 11 grand to spend on a watch, and you would need at least 11 grand to even entertain that Rolex, because currently on the gray market it's trading around 13, 14 grand, and it doesn't look like it's particularly easy to get it at retail. So these are comparable in terms of price. And honestly, it's a no-brainer. This is a much better looking watch. It's a more interesting looking watch. It's more distinctive and has a lot of character, and having that internal rotating bezel, it's not something you see a lot of. And it's definitely a watch that's going to be much less common. So without a doubt, this is a clear competitor. So as an offering, I think that this is really good. And then bringing this all back to what I was talking about, how JLC's current collection is so heavily vintage inspired. One thing I like about these two new releases is that they're now pushing beyond the boundaries of what the original Polaris did, and they're pushing beyond the vintage inspired boundaries, in the sense that these are dive watches. They have a gradient dial that wasn't present before. Both of them are still honoring their heritage, but they're breaking away from that original base. When you look in 2018, when they released the original Polaris collection, that was pretty much one-for-one copies of the original with some dimensional changes and of course mechanical upgrades. Now, if this is the direction they're going, they're expanding the collection even further from the original to create something new, then I think that's something really positive, and I'd be really intrigued to see where this goes next and if they keep going in that direction. Does this mean I've had a change of heart though? No. I'm still always going to wonder what would be JLC's current equivalent in the alternate universe where they didn't discontinue the Master Compressor collection and they were still pushing full-on modern. I'd be curious to know, if I'm honest. And also, based on some of your comments on my previous video, I can definitely recognize that we vote with our wallets. At the end of the day, companies like JLC, Omega, all these companies that are doing these sort of retro styling, vintage reissues, etc., they're doing it because we buy them. And so we can only blame the company so much. A lot of it comes down to us as the consumer. If I was faced between the choice of this or its master compressor equivalent, something like the Navy SEAL, for example, I would have to think long and hard because they're both very good looking watches in very different ways. And one more point that, again, I didn't address in the original video was that also context is important. While yes, if you look at JLC's history, this isn't an original design per se, but if you look at right now what's currently available, this watch looks totally different to all the other dive watches out there. Even things like that Blancpain I mentioned, things like the Glashütte Original CQ, the Seamaster, the Submariner. Put all of those next to each other, and this definitely stands out. It doesn't look like any of those other ones. So it does have originality in the context of the current market, and I should probably have recognized that in the original video. So definitely still something to think about, definitely something I'd like to explore further within JLC and just in general as well. But I'd love to know your thoughts on this new watch and your thoughts in general on vintage reissues, on expanding the line to be less of a vintage reissue versus full-on original design. What do you think is a better move for JLC? What do you think is a better move for the industry in general? And where do you stand on that notion of vintage reissue watches or vintage inspired watches? I'd love to know your thoughts and comments. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures of this, as well as the infographics that I use throughout this video and all my others, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And if you want to keep seeing new videos about watches, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you can know when my next video comes out. And of course, last but not least, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.